On a Sunday morning in Ann Arbor, homicide detective Paul Bunton heads to the scene of a murder. The victim is 30-year-old Rebecca Greer Huff, a University of Michigan graduate student. She has been stabbed more than 50 times with what police believe to be a screwdriver. It is an MO Detective Bunton has seen before. In the past 6 months, 2 other Ann Arbor women were stabbed to death while walking home alone. 17-year-old Shirley Small and 26-year-old Glenda Richmond.
It became glaringly obvious at that point because of the wound pattern and, again, time of morning, Sunday morning, a couple of months apart, that we had a serial killer on our hands.
And we saw a young lady walking down the street at 4:30 in the morning by herself, and she wasn't just walking, she was looking around everywhere.
Terry spots a man, alone in a vehicle, who appears to be stalking the woman. Terry calls in the suspect's tag number, and dispatch comes back with the name Coral Eugene Watts.
You could hear Mary's voice go up about 3 octaves when she came back and said, that comes back to Coral Watts.
Exactly.
And he's on the suspect list. He, for whatever reason, decided to go over a block instead of staying on the main street he'd been on. And when he did that, he had to make an illegal turn.
Watts's illegal turn gives Terry grounds to pull the suspect over.
And when I heard you radio in that you had that subject stalking, that kind of got my ear. And I radioed to Don, hold him, I'm on my way. I probably made that trip back in record time because you were still at the scene when I got there.
Yeah.
26-year-old Watts is handcuffed and brought in for questioning. The suspect lawyers up and reveals nothing. But his arrest for stalking allows police to get a search warrant for his car.
It did not yield a lot of usable evidence, but it yielded a lot of things that led us to believe that he very well may have been our suspect.
Police place a tracking device on their suspect's car and place him under 24/7 surveillance.
He knew that he was a suspect in my eyes, if nothing else. And he was suspecting that he was being followed. He was suspecting a lot of things.
Coral Watts, a suspect in at least 3 unsolved homicides, has apparently skipped town.
And I happened onto an old employer that owed him money, and he had stopped by and gave him a forwarding address to Houston, Texas.
Detective Bunton picks up the phone and puts in a call to Texas. The message is simple. Houston, you have a problem. Early on a Sunday morning, Laurie Lister pulls into the parking lot of her apartment complex.
So I would park right over there that morning and just walked into the courtyard.
She makes her way to apartment 1223, unaware that a stranger is lying in wait.
And he attacked me like just before I reached the staircase because he didn't know if I was upstairs or downstairs. And he came behind me, but then he pulled me underneath into this patio area here where we were kind of hidden behind the fence there.
The attacker takes Laurie in a stranglehold and demands to know which apartment is hers.
And I remember at that point thinking, he's gonna kill me, and if I don't tell him where I live, he's gonna put me in his trunk and bury me somewhere. If I do tell him where I live, Melinda's up there.
I heard Laurie's keys at the door.
Melinda is Laurie's roommate. When she goes to open the door, she is immediately attacked.
Everything happened so quick. When he grabbed me, he put a knife to me and said that he was going to kill me. So at that time, he was also choking me, and I couldn't breathe. And then I knew that I had to do something, otherwise I would pass out. So that's when I pretended to pass out.
Melinda plays possum. The attacker drags her to the bedroom and ties her up with a wire hanger. He then returns to Laurie, choked unconscious and left lying outside.
He went outside and I heard him dragging her up the stairs, so I assumed that she was out because he was dragging her up the stairs and I could hear her body hitting the steps.
Thinking Melinda is out cold, the attacker focuses on Laurie, filling a bathtub with water and preparing to drown her.
I opened up the sliding door there to your right.
Melinda seizes her chance to escape.
So what I did is I jumped as high as I could and did a somersault, and I actually hit my head on top, and then when I came down, I landed on my knees. There was a lady sitting out, out in her little porch area drinking coffee, and that's I told her I needed help. Someone was trying to kill my roommate.
As police respond to the call, the assailant flees, leaving Lori submerged in a tub of water.
The next thing I remember is when I was in the ambulance, and I was still blacked out, but I remember jumping up and saying, Melinda, Melinda, is she okay?
While Lori is transported to the hospital, Melinda remains with police, who have arrested a man seen running away from the apartment.
I went out there and I had to go to the police car, and of course the door was open, and they asked me if that was him, and I said yes, and he just, gave me one of those looks.
The man ID'd by Melinda is Coral Watts, the same man suspected of 3 unsolved slayings in Michigan. Watts agrees to plead guilty to a charge of burglary with intent to commit murder. Then he admits to 9 more killings in the city of Houston in exchange for a deal.
Well, the agreement is that he was offered immunity on the cases that fell under the jurisdiction of Harris County and Houston.
Watts's confessions close the books on 13 unsolved homicides. Without a grant of immunity from Ann Arbor, Coral Watts goes silent about his time there, and detectives are left with nothing. On September 3rd, 1982, a Texas court accepts Watts' plea of guilty to a charge of burglary with intent to commit murder. Under the terms of the DA's deal, he receives the maximum sentence of 60 years in prison and is not charged with any of the murders he confessed to.
It turned out that as the case went up the appeal process, there had been a loophole.
At the time of his plea, Coral Watts was never put on notice that the water he used to try and drown his victim was considered a deadly weapon. Sitting behind bars, Watts himself picked up on the omission.
No lawyer caught it. Watts caught it. And when it went up the appeal chain, they ruled in his favor and said, you were right, you weren't put on proper notice. So his crime was kicked down into a lower category of burglary without the aggravating variable.
Burglary with intent to commit murder becomes simply burglary, and Texas's mandatory release law comes into play.
The way the mandatory release law works, it's your calendar time, known as your day-by-day time, plus good time credits. And Watts, by definition, was considered a model inmate. So he was accumulating good time at the highest rate possible.
Bottom line, the confessed serial killer turned model inmate is scheduled for release in April 2006. On a cold December night in 1979, a man named Joseph Foy witnesses the murder of 25-year-old Helen Dyer.
While I was on my back porch, I seen the man raise his hand and bring it down in a slashing motion.
Foy provides Ferndale police with a description of the suspect and his vehicle, but the lead is not enough to catch Dyer's killer. The case is cold for 2 years when Foy happens upon the face of the devil again.
I'm watching TV, and it's the nightly news, and this thing catches my eye of this black man being led into a courtroom. And I just yelled at my wife, that's the guy that killed that woman.
The man on the news report is Coral Eugene Watts.
I did believe what he was telling me because he sounded so certain of himself, and so he had details. He sounded like he really wanted to come forward, but, hey, I've tried this before. Will you just listen?
The Attorney General's office issues an arrest warrant for Coral Eugene Watts, charging him with the murder of Helen Dyer nearly 25 years after the fact. On November 7th, prosecutor Donna Pendergast goes to trial. Her case hangs upon the testimony of one eyewitness in a dark alley, 80 feet away from the crime scene.
But I also felt confident that after hearing about Watts's numerous cases in Texas, that if we could get a judge to show that we had a pattern and we could get similar ex-testimony, and that we'd have a much stronger case.
Judge Richard Kuhn agrees and allows Watts' confessions to 12 prior murders into evidence.
Each and every one of them, alone, stalked, murdered.
You do say upon your oath that you find the defendant guilty of first-degree premeditated murder.
Coral Eugene Watts is found guilty of the murder of Helen Dyer and sentenced to the maximum in Michigan, life in prison without parole. The Ann Arbor murders remain unsolved.